cultivating an atmosphere of soul care in your church on this edition of Truth and Love. I'm Dale Johnson, and you're listening to Truth and Love, a podcast of the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors, where we seek to provide biblical solutions to the problems that people face. And today on the podcast, if you've been listening for very long, you've heard my dear friend Scott Mehl. Scott is a pastor out at Cornerstone Church in West LA. He's been a pastor there for 15 years and he's married to his wife, Laura. They have 4 children. He's an ACBC member. He's one of my favorite people right now. He's pursuing to become a fellow at ACBC, which is so grateful.
That's right.
And as our organization grows, we need the strength of fellows. And Scott is one of those guys that, you know, in the future, if you're pursuing certification, that you could walk through certification with the supervision portion. And so grateful for those guys who engage in that ministry. Lifelong friendships are born, and the quality of counseling care that we want to produce at ACBC depends a lot upon guys like Scott who will walk you through the supervision portion of ACBC certification. But today we want to talk about how to cultivate this atmosphere. This seems to be sort of even an enigma, something we desire and want, but almost as if it's some sort of, it's elusive to some degree, right? Is we want this idea, we sort of know what we're after, but sometimes it seems hard to grasp. But I want to discuss this today. I mean, you've seen this in your context, Scott. But let's talk first. Why would we even want to desire some sort of atmosphere like this? Why is soul care ministry an important part of the work of the local church?
I think that's such a good question, Dale, for all of us to ask, right? What is it that the local church should be about, right? And what should it be known for? What should people, and I think there's a lot of things that it's about, right? It's about reaching the lost. That's why it exists. It's mission. It's about defending the truth, but it's also fundamentally about caring for one another and caring for the souls in the community, in the church. And because of that, we need to not just have like a side soul care ministry, right? That this like little thing that cares for people's souls. I think soul care ought to be a part of the woven culture of the life of the church. And part of this is because that's what the elders have been given explicit responsibility to, right? And he was to watch over and care for the people's souls. I think of Jesus's exhortation to Peter. It just echoes in my mind. You know, he was calling Peter, but kind of through Peter to all of us as leaders and one another in the church, when he told him to feed my lambs repeatedly, to tend my sheep, to feed my sheep. And then we see that throughout the New Testament explained as us, both as pastors and as one another's, being the hands and feet and the mouth of Jesus in the lives of one another. Because the reality is nothing in the world provides hope in the midst of suffering and sin like the gospel.
That's right.
Right. And the gospel and the delivery of the gospel and the reminders, the renewing of the mind with the gospel, it is that's the local church's responsibility, right? That's what we exist to do in one another's lives. And so this is why I think soul care, counseling, discipleship, caring for one another has to be more than just a ministry within the church.
That's right.
Right? But part of the lifeblood of the life of the church.
That's right. I mean, so many people get caught up in the idea that what's being promoted is some sort of professional standalone ministry that exists sort of even separate from the life of the church. And in my view, as you're articulating, I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. Part of what Jesus made wonderful declaration about is that people outside would know that we are his people by the way in which we love one another. And you see what happens, that begins to flip the narrative of the way often lost people see our churches. Some lost people in our culture see our churches as just needy places that want things from them and that sort of stuff. When we love well and when we care well in the ways that you're describing, that flips the narrative where we say, no, we're here to serve you. We're here to take care of you. We want to sacrifice ourselves and give for your good. And that's a desirous thing, something that throughout the whole of the life of the body, everything the church is called to do is about caring for the souls of people through the Word by the structure in
Hmm.
which God has given. But again, let's talk about this professional distinction here, because a lot of people get this confused in thinking that what we should be pursuing to make our church a soul care ministry is produce some sort of professional setting, or formal setting, maybe is a better term. The
Yeah.
way I would describe this is a formal setting of counseling actually comes out of the overflow of what's happening already among God's people in the church. And that helps us to sort of
Exactly.
arrive at maybe my next question for you, which is, who should engage in soul care in the church? And the reason that's an important question is, in our culture right now, we think, well, it's only the expert, it's only the guy who has a
Yeah.
doctoral degree behind his name. He's had years and years and years of extensive training and that sort of thing. And I'm not minimizing training, but we say
Mhm.
that that's sort of an exclusive group. You go to him
Mm.
for shepherding, even. That's the idea, and we want to distinguish that. So talk through that. Who should engage in this soul care in the church?
Well, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's so important, right, Dale? Because that's just not the model we see in the New Testament,
That's right.
right? In the New Testament, over and over, we see that the short answer is everyone, right?
Hmm.
Every Christian. This is 1 Corinthians 12, right? If one member suffers, all suffer together,
Hmm.
right? I didn't say if like one member suffers, the counseling that his counselor suffers with him,
That's right.
right? Like everyone suffers together. When somebody rejoices, all rejoice together. If um, Galatians 6, when it talks about restoring someone in sin, he says, if anyone is caught in any transgression, and I mean those words, right? Any, this is for everyone. If anyone is caught in any transgression, he says, you who are spiritual
Hmm.
should restore him in a spirit of gentleness.
Hmm.
Well, the one who's spiritual isn't like the super spiritual Christian. That's
Hmm.
not like the second layer Christian. Galatians 6 comes right after the end of Galatians 5, which is the fruit of the Spirit. It talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And so he's basically saying, if you're a Christian
Hmm.
and you're bearing any fruit in your life, then you are the ones who are called to restore one another, in a spirit of gentleness. Or Ephesians 4, when he talks about, when Paul writes to the Ephesians that the body gets built up as all the different parts
Hmm.
speak the truth in love
Hmm.
to one another. And as they work together, that's what builds up the body. That's how we become more and more like Christ. And so um, ultimately, the answer is that everyone should be involved in the caring of souls for those around him. The Lord, whoever the Lord has placed around you in your local church, in your small group,
Hmm.
people that when they're struggling with sin, when they're struggling with suffering, when they're under God's placed you in their life for a reason.
Hmm.
Maybe not to singularly be the only input in their reason
Hmm.
or input in their life, but to be a significant input of truth and compassion. And at the same time, while the answer is everyone,
Hmm.
there are also those who are particularly gifted,
Yep.
who go deeper, who
Hmm.
do provide a service to the church, who use their gifts and get equipped in their gifts to provide even more expansive ministry in the life of the church. And ultimately, if it's everyone, that also means that includes pastors. That doesn't just include pastors.
Hmm.
That path is led by pastors.
That's right.
Past, Pastors are meant to not just teach, not just study, although teaching and studying are incredibly important. I
Hmm.
dedicate all sorts of time to it in my own life, but also soul care,
Hmm.
caring for individuals compassionately, carefully, patiently,
Hmm.
is also a call of pastors in their shepherding as well. And
Hmm.
so that again, that takes different forms in different roles in
That's right.
different ways. But when we understand the life of the church and God's design for the church that way, it produces not just specific ministries that
Hmm.
provide soul care in
Hmm.
the life of the church, but it provides a vision for the body,
Hmm.
a vision for the church family as a whole, that produces a culture, right, an atmosphere of soul care within, which is what God's designed for all of us, because we all desperately need that. I mean,
Hmm.
even as a pastor, I need that. I need to live in a community that has a culture of caring for souls when I'm hurting, when I'm
Hmm.
struggling, um, because that's God's the means God's provided for us.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are a couple of pitfalls, even as you're describing that. I want to highlight,
Yeah.
for the listeners. Certainly, when we answer this question about who should be engaged in this, we want to, um, you know, disavow or move away from the idea that this has to be some sort of professionalized approach, right? That some sort of expert is the only one who can engage in this ministry. The other thing that you mentioned that I think is important is sometimes pastors, when they hear us talking about biblical counseling and they hear the weight that Scripture presses upon them of shepherding, they sort of get this mentality that it only has to be them, right? And now they're thinking, man, I study so much to prepare a wonderful meal on Sunday to preach it to people so that they can feed upon the word. How in the world am I going to have time to do that? That's not what we're suggesting.
Mm.
What we're suggesting is
Yeah.
that you lead and model this, and that the beauty of the New
Yeah.
Testament is it doesn't deduce this down to you. You have a primary responsibility, but it also exposes the whole of the church, every believer, to engage in this type of ministry. This is the evidence of the gospel working in us, that as we love God, naturally what begins to happen in our social context is we begin to love those other people that we're around. And so the ministry multiplies, right, as it's led and modeled by the elders, but then it's
Yeah.
also effectively done by those in the church. And that creates sort of this atmosphere, as you're describing, or this culture that people want. We want to be cared well for. And when that's a part of the culture and it's normative, it's something that people want. They want to be a part of that type of true, legitimate New Testament fellowship. So, as we progress this idea and we think about this idea of soul care being in the church, and we sort of suggested that it's the answer is not just, hey, let's turn the lights on at some building and start this professional counseling ministry, but we need to flesh that out a little bit more. So we've sort of suggested that. So why is the culture of soul care a necessary, and I like that idea, necessary component of soul care ministry?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in ACBC, we see this all across ACBC, right? That soul care ministries, particularly gifted and trained and equipped counselors or pastors that are doing counseling, are in a huge blessing and a necessary component to the life of the church, right?
Mhm.
People that are particularly gifted. But one of the realities is, and I think every counselor, every ACBC member, every pastor knows by experience that there are more issues in the church. There are more hurts in the church than their counseling ministry, than their pastoral team
Mhm.
will ever be able to address
Yep,
themselves.
that's right.
And so there are always more needs, right? There are always more struggles and things to address. And I think this is why, even in doing soul care, in doing counseling, and doing biblical counseling, so many pastors and even ACBC members probably feel overwhelmed at times, right? Like there's just the needs are too great.
Mhm.
And that's one of the reasons why I think God's created not just a select few to do soul care,
Mhm.
but he's called and created a body, a whole family to do this, so that the vast majority of those struggles, the vast majority of those hurts ought to be addressed not by necessarily directly by the pastor, not
Mhm.
directly by the biblical counselor, but by just the other Christians around them in their life. And also then when a particularly difficult or complicated situation arises and the pastor or the biblical counselor helps walk someone through a season,
Mhm.
they have somewhere to send them to for the ongoing discipleship,
Mhm.
for the ongoing walk with Christ, for the living out of that journey of struggle against sin, for
Mhm.
the living out of that journey of redemption through suffering, um, which can't all be housed in a pastor or a pastoral team,
Mhm.
or even a team of biblical counselors. The needs and demands, the discipleship demands of the church are far too big for that. So that's why God has designed the local church as the context for personal ministry in as a whole. This is why we need a culture of soul care, not just particular soul care practitioners, but something that where everyone is recognizing their part in God's design for caring for those around them.
That's right. And that's part of why we get in trouble when we dismiss the work of the church as even a method of soul care
Mm,
in everything that the church does, from preaching, from engaging in the one another's discipleship. I mean, all of that is a process of caring for the souls of people. Now, as we try to land this plane, a couple of things that we want to sort of bring into focus, and I want to get to talking about some resources at the very end, but First, I want to just give you an opportunity to just talk about some very practical ways to cultivate soul care in the church.
Yeah, I mean, as a member, if you want to help cultivate soul care, a culture of soul care in the church, I think you do that most powerfully simply by loving those around you, by
Mm,
engaging in it yourself and caring for compassionately for the hurts of those around you, stepping into issues and messes around you, not avoiding them, but engaging with people. Um, but then, as a leader in the church, as a pastor, as an elder, as another leader in the church, I think there's all sorts of practical steps you can take. I mean, one is just teaching about it, just
mm,
making sure that we're putting before people and reminding them of their call to be engaged in one another's lives. Even as pastors, just preaching sermons that always have very practical, direct, and insightful application.
mm,
Always, we talk about here landing the plane all the way down onto the ground.
mhm,
Not ending the sermon where you're just kind of hovering with ideas about how this applies to life, but getting really practical. I think the more practical we get in our preaching, the more people see how the truth of the word of God applies to their lives, and it engenders this expectation that we should be engaging with one another about these uh, the deepest hurts of our souls with one another in the context of the church. And like we've talked about, leaders set an example. I think
mm,
as pastors, the greatest way to help facilitate
mm,
a culture of soul care is to engage in soul care ourselves. Not
mhm,
because we're going to be able to do it with everyone, but just because we lead by example. And then uh, one of the biggest components for us in our local church has been the conviction that we ought to be equipping everyone, not just counselors, not just, but and this for us, this has started with our small group leaders. So
mm,
every small group leader ought to be equipped in the basics of biblical counseling, the
mhm,
basics of transformation and change, not just those who raise their hand and say, I want to be a counselor,
mhm,
right? But everyone. And as we equip everyone, they see that, oh wait, I have something to
mm,
offer. And then I think too, practically just talking openly and honestly about the struggles people have.
mm,
Um, Not avoiding things because they're a hot button issue,
mhm.
or because we're afraid it might, bring messes to the surface. We ought to be interested in bringing their messy situations to the surface. And so talking openly and honestly about the struggles people have, both publicly and privately, I think facilitates that as well. And finally, I think just teaching about suffering,
Mm.
um, helping people have a theology of suffering and thinking well about suffering, um, is another practical thing that helps to create that culture as well.
No, that's great. One final thing I'm going to mention your book, Loving Messy People, which I think is very helpful, particularly in relation to this topic. I think it will sort of foster with elders and pastors a desire to see this type of ministry in their church and not be afraid to deal with the messiness of the lives of people. But I want you to give maybe one or two resources that sort of have helped you to think well in these areas before we close.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for pastors, one of the books I found really helpful is the Pastor in Counseling, um, by Jeremy Pierre and
Mhm.
Deepak Raju. I
Yeah.
think that's um, it, even for pastors that are thinking, okay, how am I supposed to engage in this? What's my role? That could be a helpful
Mhm.
resource as well. And one of the books that's been one of the most consistent parts of the equipping in our church family over the years has been Counsel from the Cross
Mm,
by Elise Fitzpatrick, which again just helps people see how the realities of the gospel
mm,
open the doors to our deepest struggles and pains, and meet us with hope. And it also shows how equipped all of us are to doing that ministry with one another. And also just a plug for, and there's so many different ACBC members and fellows that have written all sorts of those small little practical kind of booklets,
mhm,
and they're produced by a number of different publishers. But the more we can get practical truths into people's hands, if you have a collection of those and just you know handing them out, that's a great resource that helps people see how the truth of God applies to even sometimes what they feel like are non-spiritual issues, things that don't have to do with their relationship with God. But those have been huge practical helps in our context as well.
Well, Scott, that's so helpful, and we want to encourage. I think you've done that today, pastors and elders, to think through these things, and even to exhort them to move in this direction, to help them to think well about equipping their people and engaging in soul care themselves. And what a beautiful thing! Thanks for spending time and giving us some helpful insight on these subjects. You're listening to Truth in Love, a podcast of ACBC. I want to remind you of Scott's book, Loving Messy People. I think it'll be helpful as he's wrestled with and thought through how to engage properly, not dismiss, but engage properly the messiness of lives, our own life particularly, and then the lives of people around us, even in our church. And to do that with gospel grace and gospel love, gospel compassion, in a way that really builds this culture of care that he's been describing. And we also have several different resources on our website where at different conferences and venues where we've had ACBC members teach on these types of subjects. And I want to remind you of the treasure trove of resources that we have on our website in the form of audio and video training that can help you and encourage you to think through this particular topic, building a culture of care. What an important thing. And I'm so grateful that Scott was able to spend some time with us and share some of those thoughts. Now, if you're interested in those resources, I want to encourage you to visit us at biblicalcounseling.com.